All right, let's move to what just happened. In our what just happened segment today, we're going to address an MIT report that was reported in Fortune, I believe, a few weeks ago. It was actually I was out of the country for about 10 days, but it must have hit before I left because it felt like it was just all over LinkedIn for nonstop, and I wasn't much on LinkedIn while I was hiking the Camino de San Benedetto. But I saw like a gazillion posts about it, and the headline was that MIT did this survey over the course of about 6 months on 300 or over 300 AI initiatives that different businesses or organizations, I guess I should say, were running pilots. They did interviews with representatives from the organizations, and they did surveys. And that their sort of like top line finding was they're mostly failing, or at least that's what the headlines reported. I think the more specific finding was that very few of those organizations were showing or seeing real P&L effect as a result of their AI pilots. Like a very small percentage of them were really seeing real ROI if you measure ROI only in like your bottom line, right? Your P&L. And they all also reported high adoption rates. Like people are using it. People are using ChatGPT. They're using Copilot. But they just weren't seeing the improvements across their organizations in a way that they were seeing a difference in their bottom line, in their revenue. And there's a lot of, there was a lot, if you went and actually read the report and not just the headlines or the people talking about it on LinkedIn, there was a lot more detail actually about what they really found and what they didn't, and where the gaps come from, and who was finding a way to actually get real value out of their experiments. There was lots of like pushback and critiques of the study itself, like who was actually interviewed, how scientific it really was, what to make of it. But it does feel like, to me, we have a point, maybe, kind of late every summer, where there's this like one article. Last summer it was a Wall Street Journal piece where the report is like, it's not really happening, AI's kind of failing, and the bubble's about to burst. And that's what this kind of felt like to me, at least the swirl around it. I don't think I want to put that on the MIT researchers. I don't think that's fair. I think they just reported what they found. But that was the swirl around it, which was then belied by the Oracle earnings report, which was like mind-bending. But I'm curious what you thought of it, what you thought of the swirl around it, and how or whether it resonates with what you're seeing. You're working regularly with all kinds of legal organizations that are running pilots at this point. Some of those pilots that you helped them design, I think, and others that they've designed on their own. And tell me what your reactions were to the report, the swirl around the report, and how it aligns with what you're seeing in the market.
Yeah, I mean, the underlying discussion in the report really resonated with me with what we see on the ground. The headline takeaway is what was the disconnect of, if the takeaway is 95% of pilots are failing and therefore AI is all overhyped and we should just abandon all efforts to integrate AI in our organizations, that's the part that's getting all the attention, and the part with which I would disagree. When you dig into the report and it starts talking about the high levels of adoption, particularly of things like ChatGPT or Copilot, that's definitely what we see on the ground. I was just doing a retreat the other day where I asked a room full of lawyers how many people are using ChatGPT on a daily basis, and almost everybody's hands went up, which is very different from even in the spring. So the adoption is way up. People are not seeing, people meaning law firms, corporate legal departments, ROI in terms of, growth in revenue, savings to their bottom line yet. But I think that makes complete sense, because we've followed Ethan Malick's work or other people's work. I know Andrej Karpathy, in that great presentation he did early in the summer, talks about how unusual this technology is in the directional way it reached us, that most advanced technologies reach us because they're first developed at a really high level at the government, like somewhere like NASA, and then they're deployed in corporate environments, and then they reach individuals. And this has been deployed in the exact opposite direction, from individuals and then possibly up through corporations and then maybe through the government and geopolitically. So it's not surprising to me that we're all experimenting with them at the role level, and then we'll figure out what it means for our organizations. I take the position, and I know we've spoken with people who feel differently, that this is a very different type of technology, that it requires a more organic way of engaging with it than other types of technology, and that overly structured pilot projects, in my opinion, are not necessarily the right approach to learning how to work well with Gen AI. I like to just experiment and tinker with it. And if I were asked to adhere to like a specific rubric, I would probably ignore that and just go off and surf on my own and figure out how to use it however I wanted. And I think that's probably more of what is reflected in the report, is people going off grid and using the tech in ways that make sense to them. And that's also what we see with firms, is that, a tax attorney is going to use it completely differently than a real estate paralegal, is going to use it completely differently than a marketing professional. So it's going to take a lot of time for that to shake out and to start making sense at an organizational level. But that doesn't mean that the transformation is not happening, if that makes sense. Does that align with how you think about the transition underway?
Yeah, it does. As you know, like my teams have all been building all kinds of workflow improvements, new products, new services with the technology. And we have a bit of a, let's try it all approach, in large part because we can learn by trying. We can learn what the technology can do and what it can't do just by trying to build some of the good ideas that people have, and also because people across the business who sit in different seats have a better sense of how the technology might make a difference for their workflows. Like, I'm just not going to know how the finance team might get benefit from it, or how the marketing team can improve what they do or their reach with it. They can, but I can't. But I've said this before. Like, we've had a few things we've built that really like didn't work out, and for sometimes for the jagged edge problem, the technology just wasn't going to work for that particular use case. Sometimes it was more work to put the solution together than the parties appreciated. For it just didn't really produce something that people wanted. And then other use cases that were wildly successful. I haven't translated all of them into P&L like success, because that's not how we're thinking about it. We're thinking that we need to learn all the ways in which we can do what we do better and serve more people with the technology. And we do put some, measurements around some of what we're seeing, because I think it's useful to be able to talk about it that way. How much time is saved when you give people a faster, more accurate way to produce a timeline across a set of pleadings, for example, or the case managers can use the arbitrator search tool with natural language instead of trying to manipulate the old school system. But I think there's a lot of what we're building that will show up in success rates. Whatever, I define that a little more broadly than just P&L, but we're a nonprofit with a mission that we serve. But it's going to be a while before we can disaggregate all the different things going on and figure out where to credit the technology versus the people empowered by the technology, or both, I think.
And if you think in the law firm context, when you have timekeepers, one of the biggest challenges is just people finding the time to figure out, even if they're experimenting or using the the general Gen AI tools like ChatGPT or Copilot, they're doing that in their spare time, which is minimal because they're billing with the rest of their time. And so one of the challenges in a law firm context is creating billable incentives. Like if you're giving out billable hours for people to be experimenting, that takes away from your revenue. So you have to be willing to invest that time by taking a hit to your revenue. And I mean, recognizing that ultimately you might be taking a bigger hit to your revenue if you find efficiencies through what you're learning in Gen AI. And then you're going to have to reshape your pricing models, which is what we're seeing in conversations with law firms. They are they know this, but they're starting to feel it, is they've got these dual challenges now. People are starting to adopt it. We want them to adopt it because we have to maintain competitiveness in this environment. We have to find ways to carve out the time, which doesn't align with our business model. And then when we carve out the time and we're successful at it, that's going to carve out revenue from our existing model. So we also need to find time to figure out a new model and how we price that. So in our industry, in the private sector part of our industry, it's even more complicated than the MIT study, because the revenue is going to go in the opposite direction when you start finding gains from efficiency. So, I think it's all the findings sort of align with what we're seeing on the ground in terms of change management having to happen. And then it's even more complicated once the change management begins to actually happen.
Yeah, not to mention the technology is a moving target, right? I mean, you build these, you build these systems on the latest model, and then there's a new model, and you have to have a robust way of auditing what you've built is doing. We're Diana and I are talking. My chief technology officer are talking about this all the time with what we're building. Like, what's our audit process going to be, and what are we going to do if OpenAI changes the model and it affects some of what our tool is supposed to be doing? Are we going to shut it down and put up a big notice to everybody, like, we're on hold for a little while? I mean, there's so many complicated pieces to this change management moment that make it hard, I think.
But one thing that I'm starting to see, and 2025, like the middle of 2025, this started happening. And you and I have had this in presentations, in headlines, but I'm starting to see it in conversations, is lawyers starting to see the possibilities, and like one-on-one conversations with lawyers of like, oh, the things that I used to do on paper that I could never find as a litigator, I'm now able to upload all these documents, and it's like this sorcerer almost can bring them to life, and I can now do these things with information that I could never do before. And that's like a whole new world for me. Or, like patent attorneys finding things in a patent application that the review of 5 other attorneys never would have found, that is a material difference. So those light bulbs are starting to go off, but like you said, it's all going to take time. And it seems like the media wants to find a reason why it's all a house of cards. But I think the difference with other bubbles is that people actually are using this, and they are finding like amazing, breathtaking cases in their own lives that show the promise of what's ahead, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So keep plugging along with your experiments, and the models are getting stronger, and we'll keep seeing more use cases. And change takes time, and human change takes longer than tech change takes. So